Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Grant Shirk, and I'm the Head of Product Marketing over at Vera. I want to welcome all of our East Coast attendees who are joining us live just before lunchtime, and also to any early birds joining us here on the West Coast. We have about 30 minutes of content today. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. We are using the ReadyTalk platform today. And we'll be answering questions afterwards. If you have any challenges with the audio, with the service, please go ahead and use the chat with presenter box in the lower left-hand corner. We have a couple team members as well as a ReadyTalk operator on the line who are willing to assist you with any challenges. You also can log into the audio via voice over IP using your browser if that's easier for you. If you do have questions throughout, we're going to kind of run this as a dialogue today, so please do get those in and we'll get them prioritized if we have any extra questions. The structure of the presentation today, we're going to talk through some industry context and some of the challenges that our customers and RFA customers are seeing, and then we're going to demonstrate some of these concepts in practice in the Vera product. So with that said, and to get us started, I would love to introduce you to our special guest speaker today, who is Grigoriy Milis, who is the CTO of RFA, Richard Fleischman Associates. How are you doing this morning, Greg?
I'm doing great. Good morning.
Good, fantastic. We're happy to have you here. We're excited about the partnership we announced a few weeks ago. We've been working together now, I think, for 4 or 5 months since late last year when you and I first talked. And I think there's a really exciting opportunity for your customers and for our companies to really address some of these interesting data security and data control challenges. What are you seeing in terms of the questions some of your customers are asking around data security these days?
Well, the questions about the data security are really driven by 2 major factors. One is the SEC guidelines, SEC cybersecurity guidelines that actually, put a very substantial emphasis on the data security, especially the latest release of the guidance update. It was all about the data security, data governance, data loss prevention, and everything else that relates to essentially protecting the data. And let's face it, when SEC is talking about data security, their main concern really is protecting your customers' privately identifiable information. And it's a very challenging situation. And typically for years, you have your encryption trust that was kind of addressing these issues, but today, in today's environment, the data is restless, and it's not at rest anymore, and it's being used all the time, and protecting this data by, let's say, your kind of standard encryption mechanisms is just no longer sufficient. And on another hand, you have a situation where the employees are demanding more and more mobility, ability to work remotely, ability to travel and access the data at any given point. And it creates another conflict, let's say, with the data protection. But at the same time, people need to be able to efficiently do their jobs. Yep. And it also creates a conflict when you're protecting data with the typical encryption mechanisms. You're really unable to control when person that actually is supposed to use this data, can potentially create copies of the data and use it in ways not intended. And, this type of kind of two-punch situation, so to speak, is really make it very challenging to use the traditional encryption or data protection mechanisms in today's environments.
Yep. Yeah, and I think I love that phrase you used, which is data is restless.
Yeah, I'm going to copyright it.
Fantastic. I'll make sure, maybe we can race to that one. Because I really like that idea because it highlights this kind of creative and dynamic tension that exists in any regulated industry, but probably most poignantly in financial services. And so what we're going to do, kind of building on these ideas that you talked about, this idea of restless data and our responsibility to protect it, as well as the need to make our team members more effective, more efficient, and more able to meet the expectations of customers. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the latest on the SEC guidance we're getting from the OCIE. Look at some of these new tools and opportunities that RFA has to offer to solve this challenge and actually demonstrate some of that. But to get into the context a little bit, I think it's interesting that this is the second year in a row that the OCIE and part of the SEC has really put a big emphasis on cybersecurity, data control, and governance. In fact, late last year, there was a really interesting survey and results that the OCIE put out, I think it was in September of last year. They polled roughly 100 different organizations across broker-dealers and asset managers. And we're really trying to figure out preparedness, whether firms themselves would self-report how ready they were to deal with some of these challenges, regulations, and kind of compliance obligations. And what really struck me was the percentage of firms that had reported one of these data loss events. It was almost 3/4 of investment advisors and almost 9 out of 10 of the surveyed broker-dealers had this challenge. And I think this is really driven by the velocity of information that we have to work with. We work in these high-performance environments. We need to work very quickly. We need to make decisions very quickly. We need to share effectively. But at the trade-off for that speed and agility is oftentimes a little bit of loss of control over the information. And at the same time, I think to follow on that, same month that they published those survey results, they issued their second security alert, and then they also reiterated this in January of this year, is that in order for firms to promote these better compliance practices and to provide really a validation that organizations have the cybersecurity preparedness and controls in place, they put an initiative forward to focus on very specific areas. And the ones that really jump out to me are around GRC, governance and risk assessment, the ability to control access rights and access management, and the ability to prevent the leak or loss of data as it flows across these different challenges. And of course, sitting behind all of this are things like incident response. How do I respond when a breach happens? How do I manage and prevent and protect the confidentiality of the data that I'm working with? Because we deal with not only a lot of sophisticated financial models, but also our clients' data. And then of course, the training and the regular reminders of how to handle data in the most secure way. I mean, at the core, what we're doing and what the SEC is saying is their priority is protecting access to client information. And really, as you mentioned, is that data is restless or in use. And that's really the concept that we think about. There's been a lot of effort put into securing data in transit, data at rest when it's not doing anything. But it's the data in use that's most valuable to our organizations and also to our customers. So, Greg, you touched on this a little bit, but of this list of focus areas, what do you find are your customers are saying are the toughest to meet or the toughest to handle?
Well, I mean, it's obviously the SEC guidelines obviously is driving a lot of conversations with the clients about the data protection. But really, one of the toughest parts of the data protection is not necessarily locking down data to a point where nobody can access it, but rather resolving the situations where you have certain people in the company who are supposed to have access to the data, but at the same time you want to prevent those people from essentially misusing the data or losing the data, or otherwise taking the data out of the let's say acceptable usage scenarios, right? And the typical encryption mechanisms are really cannot deal with this type of situation. And another situation is then when you have authorized people to working with the data and they've been compromised. It certainly can create a very unpleasant situation for any organization. And even SEC aside, I mean, the data breach today, cannot just drive some kind of fine from the regulatory bodies. I actually think this is probably would be the least of the problems for any financial companies. The biggest problem would be the publicity, the need to reach out to your investors and notify them, that the potentially personal information has been lost. So this type of data breach can be absolutely detrimental, for any financial company, and this is really one of the toughest challenges that the companies need to solve.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's very true. It's that often the downstream benefits, the downstream risks of data loss that can ultimately be the most challenging and the most damaging in the long run. And I think to the second half of this conversation, one of the things that we're seeing that is making this even more challenging is that even as we are being asked to deploy more stringent compliance controls, better data security, both our employees and our clients are really demanding greater flexibility and mobility to get their jobs done. I like to think
absolutely, and this is a new challenge, right? That hasn't existed a few years back, and today, the demand for the data access from virtually anywhere, from any device, is pretty much became a de facto standard, right? And people really struggling to figure out how to maintain control of the data in this type of environments, because your traditional perimeter boundaries are really not working in this type of situation. And at the same time, if this whole mobility revolution, so to speak, or demand is really not going anywhere, and you really have to deal with it, and you have to, if you can't beat them, join them, so to speak. And this type of situation is really driving the paradigm shift in data protection from protecting data on the file system or protecting data inside the organizational boundaries or organizational perimeter is no longer sufficient, and the protection emphasis is really shifting to the data itself. So no matter where your data is located, no matter where your data is traveling, you need to be able to maintain specific permissions and control over who can access the data, when, and where.
Yeah, I think that's definitely very true. And as we kind of talk through these dynamics, right? Is this something that you are also hearing from your fellow CTOs in the world of finance? Is this?
No, absolutely. This is actually quite a hot topic amongst the not just CTOs but any IT technology professionals in any regulated industry, financial, healthcare, and any industry that deals with the data that needs to be protected.
Yep. And so I think what this comes down to is this fundamental question of, how can we operate in this world? How can we protect client and fund data without impacting how my asset managers and my analysts and my account teams ultimately work? And I think you mentioned this is what you need to do is keep control over that data as it passes through that perimeter. We do need all of the controls we put in place, whether they're firewalls or DLP or other solutions, is ultimately about protecting this information. And so what we have come to understand, what we believe very firmly, is that the most important thing that you can do to solve this is to actually move the protection to the data itself. So instead of thinking about protecting the systems and the devices and the infrastructure, actually find a way to protect that data as it travels. We think of it as attaching both the security and the control to the files and the information as they move out to your clients and limited partners, to mobile devices for employees at the firm, and even to external counsel and other people you work with. But at the same time, if you're going to do this, because we do work in a world where people like to work on their own terms and in their own tools, it needs to meet an ease of use barrier. I know that in the past we've tried public-private key exchange systems, PGP. We've tried really, really locked down containers whether they're deal rooms or ultra-secure file shares, a secure FTP. But the barrier of entry, the barrier of access is so high that you give people the incentive to work outside of the system, to skirt the protections you've put in. We really don't want that. And so to be easy to use, we feel like one of the biggest things you have to do, in addition to having it be as invisible as possible and as part of the workflow, is to not require any extra work, particularly by an external recipient. And so if you take the approach of securing the data, you also have to do it in a way that puts no requirements for no special plugins, no new accounts you have to create, no special software in order to interact with that. It has to be as simple and as natural as working natively with the data. And that's what we do at Vera, and that's why we're excited to be bringing this technology through RFA to all of you. It's really that idea of protecting your firm's data absolutely anywhere it travels. So what we do, and we'll demonstrate this here in a moment, is we allow you to simply, easily, and in many cases invisibly secure any kind of data, whether it is a prospectus, whether it's a quarterly investor letter, or if it's a detailed financial model. Protect it and make sure that only the people who should be able to see it can see it. Really tight access controls. Then we allow you to share it however you want. If you're an email-based organization, great. If you're working in file shares, no problem. Or if you're starting to take those first steps into adopting cloud platforms like Box or Dropbox or even Google Drive, protect that information no matter where it travels, no matter what tools your employees use. The benefit of then attaching the security to the data, more of a kind of a more modern IRM style approach, is that now you can track and audit every access to those files. So you know the entire really chain of control over that document. And then because you have that insight proactively and you have that information at your fingertips, you can always change someone's rights to a file or revoke access at will. Now think of the scenario where I email out an investor letter and I discover that someone is using it inappropriately or they're sharing it broadly. I can shut that file down after the fact and they'll never be able to access it again. These are common characteristics that really help any kind of business who's looking to use data security like this, but I find that they're particularly relevant in financial services with fund managers and other relevant related firms. So with that, what I'm going to do is show you a little bit of what we mean to this in practice. I'm going to share my screen with you here and walk you through a couple of these scenarios. And then when we're done, please get those questions in. Again, it's the box in the lower left-hand corner. We'd love to continue this conversation with you as best as we can. So the scenario we're going to walk through is I'm going to use a simple email workflow to send some sensitive information across organizations. What I have here is a Windows desktop, and I have a couple of files. I have one document here that is a simple, think of this as a prospectus or some kind of marketing collateral that your fund might be using to attract new customers, talk about new products and services. Also, I have an Excel spreadsheet, which is a detailed, think of it as a quarterly financial model with calculations, numbers, anything else you would think of really sharing with a customer. This is a pretty complex one with my balance sheets and my cash flows. This is information that I really want to control who has access. I want to see who is looking at it, what they're doing with it, and I want to be able to control it wherever it goes. But I also want my employees to be able to do that as easily as possible. So I have an email here that's ready to go out to Mr. Shirk at Vera, as Milis, as well as Andre, who is someone outside of my firm. And what I'm going to do is send these and have Vera step in and protect these files as they travel. We really like to make securing files as easy as attaching them to an email. With this, you'll notice when I attach these two files, we've popped in the Vera widget into the policy bar. And so this gives me the power to do two things. One, I can manually set a group of access rights. So I can pick from a set of policies that define what a recipient can do with the file and also track their access to it. Now, alternatively, when I send this off, it's going to encrypt those files. attach that security directly to it, and then track that file as it goes. And just like that, I've protected the firm's information. Now, I did this manually, and this is something we can also set up as a rule for your organization that would say, for example, any file that leaves my organization via email will automatically have these protections applied. It's actually a much more efficient data loss prevention strategy because you don't have to check through the false positives and the false accepts. We can make sure that when any files that are leaving the organization automatically will get those protections added. Now, we have here that email on a different machine. I've now received this as a recipient of that file. So I'm going to show you how easy it is to open, interact with, and then as an admin control what I can do with this file. So this is the email that Missy just sent over to me. And you can see I've got the PDF in there as well as the Excel document. I'm going to open up that Excel document. Now, in the background, what's happening is Vera is saying, okay, great, Grant is trying to open this file. Does he have access to it or not? Yes or no? And then based on his access, what rights are we going to impose on the document? So you can see here, this is opened up very, very quickly in its native editor. Very often people say, wait, that's it? That's all you had to do? It's like, yes, I'm working with a secure file. All I had to do was double click. Vera took care of the rest. The only indication to me that I'm working in a secure environment is this Vera policy bar over the bottom. And that tells me two things. One, I'm working in a secure environment, so I have the confidence that I'm working appropriately with firm data. But second, what I can do with the file. I can edit this document. I can save a copy of it, but any copy that I make will also be secure. It's not possible for someone to strip the protections off of this once they've received the file. But I've also locked down what I can do with some other components of this document. For example, I've set this so that I can only copy and paste from a secure file into another secure context. So while I can work with this information here directly in this file, I can do a quick copy, and I can paste that data out and save those changes. If I were to take that information out to an email to an unsecure Excel file, I'm going to be blocked by the operating system. It's not going to let that happen. And you can actually see that in practice here. I've actually also locked down my ability to print the document. So whether I try to print from the menu, if I use keyboard shortcuts, sorry, your printing has been disabled by policy. And Vera is actually going to track all of those activities. So for both known users and external users, it's very easy to access and interact with these documents. We're not requiring anyone to sign up for a new account, create a new password. We're integrated with your current identity credentials, or we can verify an external user quickly and easily. Now, we mentioned that securing is only part of this. We want to be able to track and revoke access to these files. So I'm going to leave this email up in the background, and I'm actually going to move over into an administrative view of Vera. We provide you a lot of visibility and tracking for compliance purposes about what's happening with your information. So while I can see across my organization how people are using the secure tools, where my files are traveling by domain, I can also dig directly into these files and see everything that has happened with them. And so we were just working with that financial statement. That's the document I have right here. I can see very quickly that just by sending that email, the people in the to in the CC line were granted access to that file, the collaborate policy that we picked. I can see that Grant accessed it one time this morning. He had it open for about 1.5 minutes. And I can actually see all of that activity right here. I can see that I opened it on my MacBook. I had it open for about 1.5 minutes, and then I was even had my printing denied, and I was copying and pasting information. I get a great audit trail of what's happened with this. And I can even see where in the world this file has traveled. This is actually an awesome way to track how your customers and your limited partners are engaging with your quarterly communications. We have a couple of customers who use this to send out their quarterly communications and then look and see where around the world our files have traveled to. The benefit of that, though, is now I can take action on that document. We'll do two things here. One, I can dynamically change the policy to these documents wherever they go. So if I wanted to, for example, I could watermark this file. I could lock it down. So maybe I'm dealing with an old prospectus that's gone out of date, or I have an old version of a financial model that is no longer valid. And so now, even if I take this file, move it to my desktop, So completely disconnecting it from that workflow, and I try to open it up again, we're going to get a completely different experience. I have watermarked this document. I've completely flattened it. So not only now can I not copy and paste like I could before, I can't edit, I can't save changes. All of that's going to be blocked by Vera. And if someone tries to take this information with them, I'm going to know exactly where it came from. I can also go one step further with that experience. And when I come back in here, instead of watermarking that file, I can actually just directly revoke my access. So imagine a scenario where potentially I have an analyst, or I have a vendor that I'm working with that I've shared information with in the past. I don't know where they've put it, but I need to make sure they can no longer access or use those files. Now when I go to open this file, almost like magic, it is technology, not magic, we have the ability to prevent them from ever opening that file again. So it's that ability to really secure, track, and revoke access to information anywhere it travels, via email, in the cloud, over a file share. That gives you a much better ability to really comply with that guidance from the OCIE, as well as meet your employees' expectations for how they're going to work. So I know we are coming up now on the end of our time, but just to summarize, what we give you the ability to do is to secure any kind of file, instantly update those permissions, and even provide things like time-bound embargo or time-limited access to it. But then also the ability to dynamically reach out and change those policies in real time, change how people can access or even revoke their access completely from the tool. Greg, how are you seeing some of your clients start to use Vera in their workflows? What are some of the first use cases that are coming up for you?
I would say is the mobility is the number one use case. And what you just showed with dynamically modifying access and revoking access is really the main kind of point, because if you allow somebody to take a subset of the data and put it, let's say, on Dropbox, you basically lost control, and at this point you have no idea how many copies of the data exist out there and who is accessing them. And the ability to allow people to work with the data, but as soon as they're not supposed to do this anymore, revoke access of every possible copy of the data anywhere is really a huge deal.
Good. I think I'm really glad to hear that. It's good to see some momentum here. We've got a few minutes left. I do see we have a few questions come in, so let me scan over these and have a look, and we'll continue answering these for as long as we have with Greg. And then if there's any that we can't get to, we will follow up with you afterwards. While I'm pulling those up and scanning through those, if you do want to learn more about Vera, you can always contact your, if you're an RFA customer, you can contact your account manager, and they will help explain the product, help you define some use cases, and then put it into place for you. You can also get more information about the product directly at our website at Vera.com. We've got some useful other demos for how we work with Box and Dropbox and other services, as well as kind of ongoing commentary about security in general on our Twitter handle at Vera Security. But the first question here, let me start from the top, is what does it mean that the document is secure, that a recipient can't strip privileges? So this kind of gets back to that idea of data in use. What we're doing with Vera is we are encrypting those files. We are wrapping them in a secure shell that enforces both access control, who can access the document, but also what you can do with the document if you do have access. And so with many other solutions, Grigoriy mentioned other people have tried to tackle the encryption problem in the past, but it hasn't really met the requirements that are set on us as firms. And so in those, usually once you decrypt a file in a traditional model, you can do anything you want with it. I mean, really all you're doing is protecting that data in transit. And then once the recipient applies the key and opens it, they have kind of carte blanche to do whatever they want. What Vera does is we maintain that document in a secure state even when it's open. And so if I make changes to the document, if I save it somewhere else, if I try to manipulate it, those protections persist. So if Greg sends me a file, I open it, make some changes, and then try to send it to somebody else who's not on the list, they're not going to be able to access it unless Greg explicitly grants me permission. And so we protect the document through its entire life cycle, from the moment it's created to the moment it's shared, and while it's being used by internal and external recipients. That actually takes us to the next question, which is, okay, there's actually a couple here about offline. So can you work with a Vera protected file in an offline or a disconnected state? And then also, if those permissions change while a file is offline, what happens? What's that workflow look like? The answer to that is you can determine exactly what happens with any given file when it goes offline. So if you have highly sensitive information, probably client data, account data, you can actually force that file online. You can not allow someone to open it in an offline world, which is probably the best way to protect your kind of crown jewels. However, if you do allow, if you have something like a prospectus or something that's it's restricted but not completely confidential, you can absolutely interact with and work with those files offline, and you can determine what they can do with them online or off. The second half of your question is, if the permissions change while a file is offline, you actually have the ability to kind of set the cache or the timeout on those permissions. So I can say this file can go dark, go offline for 1 day or 2 days or 2 weeks. But the next time they come online, we're dynamically going to check to see if those permissions have updated. And if they've gone outside of that window, we're not going to allow them to open that document until they check back in and confirm permissions. And we would work with you, and your RFA account manager would work with you to define those policies and use cases appropriately for that kind of data. Let me see. Actually, I have a question here, Greg. What are the expectations for how long it can take to get started with Vera working through RFA? Is this a 1 month process, a 1 week process? How does that work?
Well, the provisioning process is actually very quick. Typically I would say we have Vera provisioned and ready to be deployed, in a matter of days. The longest time is the really deployment, and specifically is basically working with the client to figure out, what data needs to be protected and what policies needs to be applied. So I would say realistically, this typical deployment takes somewhere between, I would say, 3 to 5 weeks.
Okay, great. And so we can work with you to start planning that out and figure out how it fits into your workflow. Looks we've got time for one more question here, and then we will go. And I'm going to combine two here that are very related, which is, what's the scope of the protection, and kind of what happens after? How can I at some point remove the protection from the document, and who can do that? So we have the ability to provide those access controls and those permissions at the document level, at the user level, at the group level, and even at the device level. And so if, for example, an analyst left the firm, with one click I can go to their user profile and revoke all of their access to any document they've ever been granted access to. It also works to say you have an analyst who's traveling to meet a client and they accidentally leave their tablet or their laptop in a taxi cab at the airport. Without affecting their ability to work, I can prevent that specific device's ability from ever decrypting a Vera file. So you have lots of levels of granularity in how you can control this. And then I know that there are scenarios where perhaps you've been working in a controlled environment, but then you need to publish information or open information back out into the public domain, whether it's a public filing, it needs to go to a website. As an administrator, you have the ability to then, you have the privileged access to be able to remove protections from a file and kind of take it back to its original state. So if you decide not to work with this anymore, or you decide to incorporate that as part of your workflow, you always have the ability at some point in your organization to kind of revert that file to an unprotected state. Really appreciate the time today, Greg. I really appreciated the the perspective and the expertise in the industry. Like I said, we're really excited about this partnership and what we can do together. And for all of you who joined from the top of the hour to just past half, your questions were great, and this was a good conversation. We look forward to hearing from more of you and engaging in this. But until then, have a great afternoon, a great Wednesday, and hopefully talk to you all soon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Bye.